If General Nisra walks onto your transport, pray she doesn't remember your face. The warning followed Lucas Reed all the way down Hangar C as red emergency lights pulsed across the steel walls like a dying heartbeat. The air smelled of burnt wiring, engine coolant, and recycled oxygen pushed through filters that should have been replaced months ago. Somewhere deeper inside the carrier, another siren began to howl. Long, hollow, tired. Lucas adjusted the strap on his duffel bag and kept walking. 6 years in military rescue operations had taught him something important about fear. The louder people talked about monsters, the less they understood them. The massive blast doors to docking bay 12 groaned open with hydraulic force. Heat rolled out first, then silence. Nearly 40 soldiers stood around the dropship preparing gear, checking rifles, loading thermal packs for the frozen wasteland below. Yet the moment Lucas stepped inside, nobody spoke. Their eyes weren't on him. They were fixed on the far corner of the bay. A woman sat alone beneath a flickering white light. At first glance, she didn't even look alive. Nearly 7 feet tall, motionless inside black-red combat armor scarred by old impacts and heat fractures. One shoulder plate hung partially cracked. A long cape, made from some dark alien fabric, spilled over the edge of the cargo crate beneath her boots. Her helmet rested beside her like the skull of some ancient predator. Lucas had seen war heroes before. Decorated officers. Planetary champions. Men who smiled for cameras after surviving impossible battles. This woman looked nothing like them. She looked exhausted. That's Nisra, a Marine muttered beside him without taking his eyes off her. The Red Death. Lucas glanced at the young soldier. Barely 20. Pale. Sweating despite the cold air. You believe all the stories? He asked quietly. The Marine swallowed hard. My brother served on Varney's station. Said her entire unit got wiped during the siege. She walked out alone. Another soldier joined in while attaching a battery pack to his chest rig. Every squad she joins ends up dead. Nobody approached her. Nobody even sat within 15 feet of her crate. The silence around Nisra felt deliberate, like an invisible wall the entire room obeyed without question. Then she moved. Slow. Controlled. One massive hand reached down to tighten a strap on her forearm armor. Metal hissed softly as the locking mechanism sealed. Lucas noticed something strange. Her hands were shaking. Barely noticeable, but enough. Not fear. Fatigue. Deep fatigue. The kind that settled into bones after too many years surviving things no living creature should survive. The overhead speakers crackled. Final deployment alert. Surface conditions on Kharos front have deteriorated. Enemy swarms advancing beyond defense perimeter. Estimated survival rate for forward units, 32%. Nobody reacted. Numbers like that had become normal a long time ago. Lucas walked toward the supply rack near Nisra's position and grabbed a spare canteen of heated water. As he passed, several soldiers stared at him like he'd lost his mind. He stopped beside her crate. Up close, she looked even larger. Dark crimson skin visible beneath the armor seams. Silver markings traced across her throat like cracks in stone. Her eyes lifted slowly toward him. Bright gold. Sharp enough to pin him in place. Lucas held out the canteen. Water's still warm, he said. For a second, neither of them moved. The entire docking bay seemed to stop breathing. Nisra stared at the offered canteen like she didn't understand what she was looking at. Then her gaze shifted to Lucas himself. Not hostile, not grateful, just confused. Somewhere outside the carrier, the first orbital impacts shook the station hard enough to rattle the ceiling beams overhead. Dust drifted down through the red emergency lights like ash falling through blood-colored snow. The dropship launched 3 minutes later with enough force to press every soldier deep into their harnesses. Metal groaned around them as the carrier disappeared behind layers of black storm clouds and orbital smoke. Lucas sat near the rear loading ramp, helmet resting against his knee while cold blue cabin lights flickered overhead. Nobody spoke above a whisper. The sound of engines filled the silence instead. Heavy, uneven, like the ship itself was nervous about flying toward Kharos front. Across from him, Nisra remained exactly as she had in the hangar. Motionless, massive armored hands resting on her knees. Gold eyes half hidden beneath shadows cast by the emergency lights. The heated canteen still sat beside her untouched. One of the Marines finally broke the silence. You really should not have done that. Lucas glanced over. Done what? Talk to her. The Marine lowered his voice further. People who get close to Nisra usually do not last long. Another soldier muttered from farther down the cabin. Maybe command paired them together on purpose. A few nervous laughs followed, thin and dry. Lucas ignored them and looked toward the reinforced view slit near the loading ramp. Kharos, 9 slowly appeared beneath the clouds. Endless trenches carved across frozen gray earth. Burned-out walkers half buried in snow. Orange flashes pulsing beneath the storm like distant lightning. The entire planet looked exhausted. 10 minutes to deployment, the pilot announced through static. Brace for atmospheric interference. The ship suddenly lurched sideways. Several soldiers grabbed their harnesses as warning lights flashed red across the ceiling. Somewhere near the cockpit, a system alarm began repeating the same message over and over. Thermal impact detected. Adjusting flight vector. Lucas tightened the straps on his rescue pack out of habit. Medical injectors. Portable heaters. Signal flares. Enough supplies to keep a wounded squad alive for maybe 6 hours if conditions stayed stable. On Kharos, conditions never stayed stable. Another violent tremor hit the ship. One soldier cursed under his breath. Another quietly started praying. Through all of it, Nisra did not move. Lucas studied her carefully now that nobody was paying attention. The stories had painted her as some unstoppable alien nightmare. But close up, the details told a different story. Scratches covered the armor near her collar. Emergency weld marks patched older damage along her side plates. One gauntlet had been repaired so many times the metal no longer matched. She looked less like a conqueror and more like someone, held together by stubbornness alone. Then Nisra suddenly spoke. Stop staring. Her voice was deep and calm, carrying effortlessly through the engine noise. Several soldiers immediately looked away. Lucas did not. You looked cold back in the hangar, he answered. One of her eyebrows lifted slightly. Cold. The canteen was not poison, if that is what you were thinking. For the first time since boarding, something almost human crossed her expression. Not amusement exactly. More like confusion trying to remember how amusement felt. She picked up the canteen slowly, turning it once in her hand before speaking again. Most humans avoid me. Lucas shrugged lightly. Most humans avoid rescue workers too. Usually means we are both having a bad day. A few nearby soldiers stared at him like he had completely lost his mind. Nisra looked down at the warm metal container for several quiet seconds. Then the dropship alarm suddenly erupted at full volume. Incoming impact wave detected. Hold positions. The entire cabin shook violently. Lights burst overhead in showers of sparks. Lucas grabbed the edge of his harness as the ship dropped hard through the clouds. Outside the narrow view slit, the frozen battlefield rushed toward them far too fast. And for the first time since he met her, Lucas saw General Nisra close her eyes like someone preparing for something much worse than death. The dropship hit the ground hard enough to throw half the cabin sideways. Metal screamed against ice as the landing gears dragged across frozen dirt for nearly 50 yards before the ship finally stopped. Steam burst through the ceiling vents. Red warning lights painted every face the color of fresh rust. For 2 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the rear ramp slammed open and the cold rushed inside like a living thing. Kharos' air felt wrong. Too dry. Too sharp. It clawed at Lucas's lungs the moment he stepped off the ship. Snow whipped sideways across the trench lines while distant artillery flashes turned the horizon orange beneath heavy black clouds. Towering defense walls stretched across the wasteland ahead, scarred by years of bombardment and freezing storms. Somewhere far beyond them, sirens echoed endlessly through the dark. Move, a field officer shouted over the wind. Delta squads reinforce eastern barricades. Rescue teams report to Medical Trench 7. Soldiers scattered immediately, boots crunching over frozen steel grates and dirty ice. Lucas adjusted the weight of his rescue pack and scanned the battlefield. The front line looked less like a military base and more like a city refusing to die. Exhaust pipes hissed steam into the freezing air. Portable heaters glowed dim red beside wounded soldiers wrapped in thermal blankets. Engineers welded cracked barricades while medics dragged supply crates through knee-deep slush. Everything moved fast. Tired people trying to hold together a world already breaking apart. Then the wind shifted. Conversation stopped. Lucas turned just in time to see Nisra walking through the trench corridor behind him. Nobody ordered soldiers to move aside for her. They simply did. Human, alien, officers, medics. Every person instinctively stepped back against the trench walls as she passed. Her heavy boots struck the frozen metal with slow, deliberate force. Clang, clang, clang. Like the battlefield itself recognized her. Lucas noticed something strange again. Nobody looked at her face. They looked at the ground. Nisera ignored all of them. Her gold eyes remained fixed ahead as snow gathered along the edges of her dark armor. She looked ancient out here. Not by age. By exhaustion. A young communications officer nearly dropped his datapad when she stopped beside him. Report, Nisera said calmly. The officer swallowed hard. Eastern sensor towers lost contact 30 minutes ago. Command believes another swarm movement is forming beneath Sector 12. Believes? Nisera asked quietly. Why yes, General. She held his stare for one uncomfortable second before taking the datapad from his shaking hands herself. Lucas watched the officer exhale only after she walked away. Does everybody react like that around her? He asked an older medic nearby. The medic gave a tired laugh while adjusting bandages on a wounded Marine. You are new here. That obvious? Last winter she held this entire trench line for 11 hours after Command lost orbital support. The medic lowered his voice. Only 12 people survived the retreat. Lucas looked toward Nisera standing farther down the trench now, staring at the gray storm clouds overhead. And they blame her for that. The medic paused before answering. People need someone to fear when things stop making sense. Before Lucas could reply, the ground suddenly trembled beneath his boots. Loose snow slid from the trench walls. Sirens erupted across the front line. Bright white floodlights snapped on above the barricades one by one. Soldiers rushed toward firing positions, while automated turrets rotated toward the distant darkness beyond the frozen valley. Lucas heard it next. A sound low beneath the storm. Not explosions. Movement. Thousands of things moving somewhere under the ice. Nisera slowly reached for her helmet. Around them, fear spread through the trench faster than the cold. But when Lucas looked at her face one last time before the battle began, he realized something that unsettled him far more than the sirens. General Nisera did not look angry. She looked tired of surviving. The first impact hit somewhere beyond the eastern barricades with enough force to shake frost loose from the trench walls. Then another followed. And another. The entire front line awakened at once. Automated cannons rotated overhead with mechanical shrieks, while floodlights cut through the blizzard in long white beams. Soldiers rushed through the trenches carrying ammunition crates, thermal charges, medical packs, anything that might buy them another hour on Kharos. Lucas moved with the rescue teams towards Sector 12, boots sliding across frozen steel catwalks slick with snow and engine oil. The wind screamed through the trenches hard enough to drown out conversation. Somewhere above them, fighter ships tore through the clouds like streaks of burning silver. Keep moving, an officer shouted through a headset crackling with static. Eastern defense grid is collapsing. Lucas tightened his gloves against the cold. Even through military-grade thermal layers, Kharos air found ways to bite through skin. Ahead, medics were already setting up emergency shelters beside a damaged barricade line. Portable heaters glowed orange against the storm while exhausted soldiers huddled around them, faces pale beneath frost-covered helmets. Nobody looked rested. Nobody even looked hopeful anymore. Then the sirens changed tone. Lower. Sharper. Every soldier in the trench froze for half a second. Underground breach detected, the automated system announced. All personnel prepare for close-range engagement. Lucas felt the vibration beneath his boots immediately after. Not one tremor. Hundreds. Like something enormous was moving below the frozen ground. The trench lights flickered once. Twice. Then half the sector went dark. Soldiers raised weapons toward the black storm beyond the barricades. Lucas reached for the flashlight clipped to his armor instinctively. Beside him, a medic whispered something under his breath that sounded almost like a prayer. And through all of it, Nisera walked calmly toward the front line. Her black-red armor disappeared and reappeared beneath bursts of emergency light, while snow spiraled around her like ash. Lucas watched nearby soldiers physically step backward as she passed. Fear moved through the trench with her. But Nisera herself looked strangely distant, like she had already seen how this night would end. She stopped beside the shattered barricade and slowly placed her helmet over her head. The gold glow of her visor activated with a soft mechanical hum. "General," a communications officer called nervously from farther down the trench. "Command requests immediate withdrawal if the eastern wall fails." Nisra did not turn around. "If the wall fails," she said calmly, "there will be nowhere left to withdraw to." Then the frozen ground exploded beneath them. Steel cracked. Ice burst upward across the trench line. Lucas barely grabbed the railing before the catwalk beneath his boots collapsed sideways into darkness. Soldiers shouted as the entire sector shook violently. One of the floodlights snapped free overhead, swinging wildly through the snowstorm before crashing into the trench below. "Move!" Lucas yelled, pulling a wounded Marine away from the edge as another section of the trench gave way. The battlefield became noise and white smoke and flashing emergency lights. Through the chaos, Lucas suddenly lost sight of Nisra completely. Then he saw her again, not fighting, not shouting orders, standing perfectly still at the center of the collapsing trench while debris rained around her. For one impossible moment, she looked almost peaceful beneath the storm, like someone too tired to run anymore. Lucas started toward her, just as the ground beneath both of them cracked open with a sound like the planet itself breaking apart. The trench floor vanished. Steel supports twisted downward into darkness. And before Lucas could even shout her name, both of them disappeared beneath the collapsing ice. Lucas woke to the sound of metal creaking somewhere above him. Slow, heavy, like an old ship settling beneath deep water. For several seconds he could not remember where he was. Everything hurt. His helmet light flickered weakly across broken steel beams and shattered ice packed around the collapsed trench tunnel. Dust floated through the narrow beam like gray snow. He coughed hard and tasted smoke inside the recycled air of his respirator. Status. His suit computer rasped through static. Multiple structural injuries detected. External temperature, -23 degrees Fahrenheit. Lucas forced himself upright with a groan. Pain shot through his shoulder immediately. Probably dislocated. Maybe fractured. He had felt worse before. Barely. The collapse had buried them deep beneath the trench network. Above him, twisted support beams blocked what used to be the tunnel entrance. No radio signal. No emergency lights. Only darkness and the low mechanical groan of unstable steel somewhere overhead. Lucas checked his gear automatically. One emergency flare. Half a battery pack. Portable heater damaged. Medical supplies mostly intact. He exhaled slowly. Could be worse. Then he heard breathing. Deep. Uneven. Somewhere beyond the collapsed debris pile to his left. Lucas grabbed his flashlight and climbed carefully over broken steel plates until the beam landed on black-red armor partially buried beneath ice and concrete dust. Nisra. One massive support beam had collapsed across her lower body, pinning her against the trench wall. Her helmet visor was cracked straight across one side, gold light flickering faintly beneath the fracture. For one terrible second Lucas thought she was dead. Then her hand twitched weakly against the frozen ground. "Hey," he said quickly, kneeling beside her. "Stay with me." Her eyes opened slowly behind the damaged visor. Confused at first, then immediately alert. Instinct. Soldier instincts. Lucas reached for the beam carefully. "You are trapped." "I noticed," she answered quietly. Even now her voice sounded calm. Too calm. Lucas activated the emergency servo braces in his rescue suit and pushed against the steel support with both arms. The beam shifted barely an inch before grinding back into place. Heavy. Far too heavy for one person. Nisra watched him struggle in silence for several seconds before speaking again. "Your shoulder is damaged. So is the rest of me." Another push. Another inch. Sweat rolled down Lucas's neck despite the freezing air. Metal screamed overhead. Finally, the beam shifted enough for Nisra to pull herself free. She sat against the trench wall afterward, breathing slowly through the damaged helmet while Lucas collapsed beside her, trying to catch his breath. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence underground felt different from battlefield silence. Smaller somehow. More honest. Above them, distant impacts still shook dust loose from the ceiling every few minutes. The war had not stopped just because they disappeared beneath it. Lucas removed his cracked helmet carefully and rubbed tired eyes. "Any idea where we are?" Nisra studied the dark tunnel ahead of them. Old maintenance routes beneath the eastern trench network. "Can we get out?" "Eventually." Her answer carried no comfort at all. Lucas noticed her hand trembling again beneath the armor plating. Worse this time. Tiny involuntary shakes she probably thought nobody saw. You are injured too, he said quietly. Nisra looked down at her own hands like she had forgotten they existed. I am functional. Lucas almost laughed at that. Almost. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a thermal blanket, tossing it toward her. She stared at it in silence. Body temperature drops fast underground, he explained. Especially after shock. Nisra did not move for several seconds. Then slowly, carefully, she wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The dark alien general sat beneath broken steel and flickering lights, looking less like a living weapon and more like someone who had not rested in years. Then, so quietly Lucas almost thought he imagined it, she asked, "Why are you still helping me?" The tunnel lights finally died 20 minutes later. 1 second the damaged emergency strips glowed weak blue across the collapsed corridor. The next, darkness swallowed everything. Lucas heard the old power systems fail somewhere deep underground with a long mechanical sigh. Then silence returned. Heavy, endless. He switched on the flashlight attached to his shoulder plate, the narrow beam cutting through drifting dust and frozen vapor. The air underground had grown colder. Every breath now escaped in pale clouds between them. Nisra remained seated against the trench wall beneath the thermal blanket, helmet removed at last. Without it, she looked strangely younger. Less like the terrifying figure soldiers whispered about, and more like someone who had simply survived too many winters. Silver markings traced along her jaw and throat like cracks through dark crimson stone. Her gold eyes reflected the flashlight softly whenever she looked toward him. Lucas sat nearby repairing the portable heater with numb fingers. You never answered my question, Nisra said quietly. He glanced up. Which one? Why are you still helping me? Lucas tightened a damaged wire against the heater battery pack. Because you are hurt. That has never stopped others. The answer came so fast, it almost sounded rehearsed. Lucas paused then. Something about the way she said it unsettled him more than the battlefield above them. Not anger. Not bitterness. Just certainty. He finally got the heater running again. A small orange glow filled the tunnel between them, warming the steel walls with weak flickering light. Nisra stared at the heat source for several silent seconds like she had forgotten what warmth looked like. You know what they call me, she said eventually. Lucas shrugged lightly. People give scary names to anyone who survives longer than expected. The Red Death. Her voice remained calm. Children on refugee worlds stop crying when soldiers threaten them with my name. Lucas leaned back against the cold wall carefully. Do you believe them? Nisra did not answer immediately. Somewhere above them, another distant explosion rattled loose dust from the ceiling. I used to, she admitted softly. The heater hummed quietly between them. Lucas washed her hands again, still shaking. Tiny involuntary tremors she could not fully control anymore. You are exhausted, he said. Nisra looked almost confused by the statement. All soldiers are exhausted. No, Lucas shook his head slowly. This is different. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You think you understand me after one day? No, he answered honestly. But I know what burnout looks like. For the first time, Nisra actually studied him instead of simply looking at him. Lucas wondered what she saw. Probably another tired human buried under a collapsing battlefield. 6 years rescue division, he explained quietly. Pulled survivors out of colony fires, collapsed stations, frozen transports. After enough disasters, you start recognizing certain things in people. Nisra tilted her head slightly. Such as, Lucas stared into the weak heater glow for a moment before answering. The ones who stop caring whether they survive. Silence settled over the tunnel again. Not hostile this time. Just heavy with things neither of them fully wanted to say aloud. Then Nisra slowly rolled back one sleeve of her armor. Lucas froze. Thin silver scars ran along her forearm in precise mechanical lines disappearing beneath the plating near her shoulder. Neural implant scars. Military grade. Old ones. They modified my nervous system after Varney's, she said quietly. Reaction speed. Combat synchronization. Emotional suppression. Lucas felt his stomach tighten. You were augmented? Weaponized. The word echoed softly through the tunnel. For 3 years I stopped sleeping more than 90 minutes at a time. The battlefield noises never fully leave afterward. Lucas suddenly understood the shaking hands. The distant stare. The exhaustion carved into every movement she made. Nisra lowered her sleeve again slowly. Now you understand why they fear me. Lucas looked at her for a long moment across the flickering heater light. Then he reached into his pack, pulled out the heated canteen she never drank from earlier, and handed it back to her. No, he said quietly. Now I understand why you are tired. Lucas woke sometime later to the sound of Nisra breathing unevenly in the dark. At first he thought another tunnel collapse had happened. Then he realized the trembling noise was coming from her. The heater between them had nearly burned out, its weak orange glow barely illuminating the frozen corridor anymore. Ice crystals crawled slowly across the steel walls as temperatures underground continued dropping. Lucas checked his wrist display. For hours since the collapse. Still no signal reaching the surface. He pushed himself upright carefully, shoulder throbbing with every movement. Across from him, Nisra sat hunched forward beneath the thermal blanket, one hand pressed hard against the side of her head. Her breathing remained steady but strained now, like someone fighting to stay present inside their own mind. Nisra. She did not answer immediately. Lucas moved closer. Hey. Her eyes opened suddenly, gold irises wide and unfocused. For half a second, she looked genuinely terrified. Then recognition slowly returned. You were speaking, Lucas said quietly. Bad dream. Nisra stared at him in silence. Somewhere deep in the tunnel system, old pipes groaned beneath shifting ice. Not dreams, she finally answered. Echoes. Lucas frowned slightly. From the implants. A small nod. Combat synchronization never fully disconnects. Sometimes during stress responses, she stopped speaking abruptly as another tremor passed through her hands. Lucas noticed sweat along her forehead despite the freezing air. How long since you slept properly? He asked. Nisra gave a faint, humorless laugh. Years. The answer settled heavily between them. Lucas had seen soldiers collapse from exhaustion before. Men running on stimulants and survival instincts until their bodies finally stopped cooperating. But this felt different. Colder somehow. Like Nisra had been surviving on duty alone for so long she no longer remembered how to exist without it. Suddenly her wrist communicator crackled to life with bursts of static. Both of them looked down instantly. A broken transmission struggled through the interference. All eastern sectors compromised. Static swallowed the rest. Then another voice emerged sharper this time. Priority command to General Nisra. Refugee convoy trapped beyond Sector 12 perimeter. Orbital fire authorization pending. Lucas immediately looked toward her. Refugees. Nisra's expression hardened the moment command entered the conversation. The exhausted woman beneath the blanket disappeared behind the soldier again. Civilian evacuation routes collapsed during the breach. The communicator crackled once more. General, command requests immediate confirmation for orbital strike. Repeat. Orbital strike authorization. Lucas stared at her. There are civilians out there. I know. Her voice remained calm, but quieter now. Too quiet. Lucas suddenly understood what this really was. The refugees had been cut off beyond the defensive perimeter. Command wanted to erase the entire zone before the enemy reached the trenches. Fast. Efficient. Clean on a tactical map. Nisra closed her eyes briefly, like someone carrying a weight too familiar to describe. This has happened before, Lucas realized softly. She did not answer. Which answered everything. The communicator continued hissing through static. General Nisra, authorization required immediately. Lucas washed her hands. Shaking again. Worse now. Not fear. Memory. You do not have to do it, he said quietly. Nisra looked at him with something almost painful behind her eyes. That is why they made me. The tunnel suddenly fell silent except for the distant storm above them. Lucas saw it clearly now. The battlefield did not fear Nisra because she was cruel. They feared her because she obeyed when nobody else could. Because someone had turned a living person into the final answer for impossible decisions. Nisra slowly reached toward the communicator at her wrist. Her fingers hovered there for one long second. Then Lucas placed his hand gently over hers before she could press the transmit button. No, he said softly. Nisra stared at him in stunned silence. If there are still civilians alive, Lucas continued, then somebody goes after them. Above them, the war continued shaking the frozen planet apart. But deep underground, beneath steel and ice and years of exhaustion, General Nisra looked at the human beside her like nobody had ever interrupted her orders before. The climb back to the surface took nearly an hour. Old maintenance ladders groaned beneath their weight, while freezing water dripped steadily through cracked tunnel ceilings above them. Lucas's shoulder burned with every movement, but Nisra never complained once despite the damage in her armor and the tremors still running through her hands. The deeper they climbed, the louder the war became. Sirens. Explosions. The distant thunder of collapsing barricades echoing through steel corridors like an approaching storm. Finally, Nisra forced open a maintenance hatch above them. Snow and freezing wind exploded into the tunnel instantly. Lucas pulled himself onto the surface beside her and stopped cold. Sector 12 was gone. The trench lines had collapsed into burning craters beneath the blizzard. Emergency floodlights flickered weakly through smoke, while evacuation transports lay half-buried in snowdrifts. Somewhere farther east, enormous shadows moved beneath the storm beyond the defensive walls. The battlefield looked less like a military front and more like the final hour of a dying world. Nisra activated her damaged wrist display immediately. Refugee convoy signal detected, she said. 3 miles east. Lucas stared at her. That is outside the defense perimeter. Yes. Her eyes lifted toward the distant storm. Which means command has already abandoned them. The communicator crackled again through static. General Nisra, orbital strike sequence ready. Awaiting final authorization. Lucas watched her face carefully this time. The exhaustion was still there. The fear too. But something else had changed underground. Something quieter. Nisra slowly looked down at the communicator in her hand. Then, for the first time since he met her, she turned the device completely off. The battlefield around them suddenly felt very silent. Lucas blinked once. You just ignored direct command. I noticed. Snow whipped violently around them as another explosion shook the frozen ground nearby. In the distance, emergency beacons flashed faintly through the storm where the trapped convoy waited beyond the ruined trench network. Lucas tightened the straps on his rescue pack immediately. Then let us move before they decide to fire anyway. Nisra looked at him for half a second. Then something almost invisible crossed her expression. Respect. They crossed the ruined battlefield fast, using collapsed trenches and destroyed transport wrecks as cover against the freezing winds. The storm worsened every minute. Ice sliced across exposed skin like broken glass, while distant artillery flashes turned the clouds orange overhead. Lucas could barely see more than 20 feet ahead through the blizzard. Then he heard it. Crying. Faint at first beneath the storm. Human voices. Alien voices too. Terrified civilians huddled beneath the wreckage of an overturned evacuation carrier buried halfway in snow and debris. Families. Injured workers. Children wrapped in emergency blankets with frost covering their hair. Lucas immediately dropped beside the nearest injured civilian and began checking vitals. We can still move them, he shouted over the wind. But we need transport. Nisra stood motionless for one long moment staring at the civilians. Lucas noticed several refugees freeze in fear the second they recognized her armor. One mother instinctively pulled her child closer. The reaction hit harder than any battlefield wound. Nisra saw it too. Of course she did. Her hands tightened slowly at her sides. Then one small alien girl stepped forward from the wreckage holding a damaged stuffed animal beneath her coat. She could not have been older than 6. She stared up at Nisra with huge frightened eyes. Are you here to save us? She asked softly. The storm held around them. Lucas looked toward Nisra just in time to see something inside her finally break. Not anger. Not violence. Something sadder. Her gold eyes lowered toward the frightened child, and for the first time since the war began, General Nisra knelt down slowly into the snow. Yes, she said quietly. I think I am. The evacuation transport barely stayed together as it crawled across the frozen battlefield through smoke and wide-out snow. Every seat inside had been stripped out to make room for refugees wrapped in thermal blankets and emergency tarps. Children slept against exhausted parents while medics moved quietly through the narrow aisle checking temperatures and oxygen masks beneath flickering ceiling lights. Lucas sat near the rear loading ramp holding pressure braces against his injured shoulder while the engines groaned beneath them. Across from him, Nisra remained standing beside the open cargo hatch, one hand gripping the overhead support rail as the storm raged outside. She had not spoken much since they escaped Sector 12. But the refugees watched her differently now. Carefully. Curiously. Not with the same fear from before. The little alien girl with the stuffed animal sat closest to her. Every few minutes, she peeked up at Nisra from beneath her blanket before quickly looking away again. The transport suddenly lurched sideways as turbulence shook the cabin hard enough to rattle loose ice from the ceiling panels. Approaching Western Defense Gate, the pilot announced through static. "Prepare for security inspection." Lucas exhaled slowly. "Here it comes." The massive trench fortress appeared through the storm moments later, floodlights cutting across the snow while automated cannons tracked every movement approaching the perimeter. The transport landed hard inside the gate sector, surrounded almost immediately by armed soldiers. Lucas saw it happen through the cargo hatch. Officers rushing forward. Weapons raised. Not toward the refugees. Toward Nisra. "General Nisra," a command officer shouted over the storm. "You are under immediate review for disobeying orbital authorization protocol." The refugees. Inside the transport went silent instantly. Nisra stepped down into the snow without resistance. Her black-red armor looked smaller somehow beneath the fortress floodlights. More tired than terrifying now, Lucas pushed himself to his feet despite the pain shooting through his shoulder. "Hold on," he muttered, moving toward the hatch. "Sir, you should remain seated," a medic warned. Lucas ignored him completely. Outside, soldiers formed a tense perimeter around Nisra while the command officer activated a glowing datapad. "Your refusal to authorize the strike compromised military operations across the eastern sectors." Snow whipped violently between them. Nisra did not argue, did not defend herself. She simply stood there in silence while exhausted refugees slowly stepped off the transport behind her. Then the little alien girl climbed down, holding her stuffed animal tightly against her chest. She looked at the armed soldiers surrounding Nisra, then at the towering alien general herself. And before anyone could react, the child walked across the snow and grabbed Nisra's hand. The entire checkpoint froze. Lucas saw it happen in complete silence beneath the storm lights. Nisra looked down slowly at the tiny hand wrapped around her armored fingers like she could not understand what was happening. The little girl smiled weakly through chattering teeth. "Thank you for saving us," she whispered. Something changed across the faces of the surrounding soldiers then. Not dramatic, just quiet. One by one, weapons slowly lowered toward the ground. The command officer looked around uncertainly before finally lowering his datapad too. Lucas stepped forward through the snow until he stood beside Nisra beneath the floodlights. "You want my official statement?" he asked calmly. The officer nodded cautiously. Lucas looked toward the exhausted refugees gathered behind them. Families alive because one soldier chose mercy over orders. Then he glanced up at Nisra herself. The woman everyone feared. The woman who still looked more exhausted than dangerous. "General Nisra disobeyed a command today," Lucas said quietly. "And it was the first truly human thing I have seen on this battlefield." No one answered after that. The storm continued falling softly across the frozen trench walls while floodlights reflected against the snow like distant stars. And for the first time in many years, General Nisra did not look like a weapon standing